Hello, my name's Sean Brown from WiSen Innovation, and in this WiSen Quick Guide video series I'm going to show you how you can set a null reference value in specific for distance nodes within the web portal. So what we have here is a very simple project where we have one single omni tilt and distance node. You can see that here in the second row down, and we have a fast reading interval, which is what we typically do after an install period. So first thing to look at here is the distance, and you can see here that this is an absolute value, which is what you would typically see after initially installing it. Now the process to set the null reference value will be to go to Setup, Node Offset. Now if you have a multitude of different models, you'll see this display. Now I'm just going to scroll down to the modeler that I'm using, and you're presented with a selection box. And so I know here at the moment I'm only interested in the distance, so I select that attribute, and I only have one serial number, or you could have this as a reference ID or alias name to select. And we tick both of those, and we press Add Offset. So by default you'll get displayed typically a day's time period. Now if you were commissioning, that would probably be suitable. But if you're doing a baseline period, you'd want to see the data for that complete time period. Obviously to do that, we click in the time period box here at the top, and we can go back in time and plot the data of interest. We can also do multiple serial numbers, and this is what that little box here is helping you do. So we can see here the range of movement is very small over the time period that I've selected, and this is the only data I have to use for this example. Now the first stage will be to select the data that you wish to offset, and everything is done through the power of the right button click. Now if I right click on the very first point here, it brings up a little second pop-up box, and what we're doing is we're adding this to the recalculation period as a start point. And here I'm going to select the whole data range. So I'm going to give you two examples of how to do this process. And by selecting the whole data range, this is going to be the option 1. Now by adding, if you're offsetting something that's happened in the past, a false step for instance, you would press endpoint here, whereas if you're nulling at the start of a project, you're wanting to set that as the endpoint, but going forward you want this value to become represented as the null. If you didn't do apply to future, then obviously the next value would be the absolute value we were looking at previously on the screen. So it's important to understand the difference here. And we press endpoint. So we've selected the whole data range. And the next kind of simple step, if you wanted to do this in the option 1, is we right click on the data selected, and we can set the current point to 0. Now you can see here, if I click away from the screen, what I've done, I can see the range visually on the screen using my eyesight. I can see the range is quite small, and I can be selective with the point that I'd like to become the 0 or the null reference. So that's quite an easy process to do. Now obviously if I was to right click on this point and set that to 0, that would be deemed more false. If this was a larger data range, that wouldn't be a suitable point to select. So that runs through the option 1. So obviously if I right clicked here, and I'll just do this as an example, and I press apply, then we can just see off the screen here is this little box has gone from yellow to blue, and we can see that I've defined the information I require. So the next step here would be to press node offset and update, and that would be the step for option 1. I'm going to press cancel here because I'm now going to go through option 2. Now going back to the selection screen, we have this same criteria selected. We go to add offset. We've got the data being displayed over the time range of interest. Again, we right click on the point of interest. We add this as the start point. Now the difference here is we're going to want to work out an average or a median over the time period. We're not selecting it through the use of the human eyesight, I suppose, to kind of look at this and define the average through human eye. We're using the mathematical calculation to define that instead. So it's important that when you're doing this step, you do not select the whole data range. Now that can either be missing a point off initially or missing the most current point off at the end of the graph. So do not select the whole data. So I'm just going to leave the most current point off, and again I want to apply this endpoint and apply it to the future. Now the next stage will be then to right click on the points, and instead of going to current point to 0, I'm going to go to this advanced offset, and we have a second pop-up window. So what this is doing is allowing you to do the mathematical analysis or the calculation of medians and averages, or define maximum and minimum for the data range you have displayed and selected. So everything within the red selection criteria is associated to the box A, current resultant value, and automatically this calculates the average over that time period. Now if I right click on the A, the current resultant value, the red information, we can see here that we have a different criteria for which we can use. So average has already been calculated, so I'm not going to do that. Now I might decide to do a median, and that obviously removes any kind of outliers of selection criteria. And if I was to press T1 start, then I don't need to define an end because it's already got the end selected. So in this same little pop-up box here, A, I now have the median defined. If I was to right click, I can do maximum, minimum, I can do a point of the selected data, or I can do customized. So I'll just run through the maximum just so we can understand what that's doing. And we have 1343.6, and if you can look on this graph, that's the maximum value. So that maximum value would be defined as the null 0 reference going forward. Now I don't want to do that. I'm quite happy to use a median. So I'm just going to go back in, redefine this as my start point. Now if you had a bad value within that data range you've selected, you've got the opportunity here to say, or to eliminate any bad data. So if we enter median, obviously I've defined my start point, and I can define my endpoint. So the red data selected with the full coloured red icon, that's the data selected, and then obviously here this is the data deselected. So hopefully that kind of clears that up. Now the next stage is the B box, target resultant value. So what do we want the data selected within the bold red values to become? What do we want this median value we see here to become? So typically this would be the median value over a baseline period, and we want that to become the null reference, the 0 point. And to do that, we need to be able to select a blue point. Now that's the whole reason why I didn't define the whole data range on the previous graphical display. Now if I go to the little blue point and I right click, you can see here that this pop-up box says target resultant value. So that does not say current resultant value as there previously, but target resultant. And again here we've got a whole criteria of analysis, mathematical tools we can use to set that reference value. But typically when a node is first installed, we are more interested in the customized, and this is letting you define that value. Now it automatically knows that I want to set this as 0, which is the most common method, and obviously if we wanted to set that as a as a historical value, for instance. If it was a crap meter, there might have been 10 millimeter of movement historically, and we'd set that as 10. But here, there is no history, and I'd like to set that as a 0 point going forward. And we finish this step, and we press confirm. If I scroll to the right, this would look different in a different web browser. Sorry, I'm using Edge. I believe if we would use Chrome or Firefox, it would be a slightly different display for this little blue pop-up box. But you can see that I've defined the criteria I'm interested in. If I had more nodes that I was interested in then undertaking the same analysis, the same data range, then we have a tool here under the A that I can apply to other nodes. So a very quick process if you've got more than one node where you're trying to, on the same asset, and you're trying to apply the same mathematical formula, the nulling reference, instead of having to do these individually. I've only got one in this case, so I'm going to press node offset update. It says please confirm to proceed, and we press confirm. And we see here a little scroll bar, a progress bar for the offset. It shouldn't take too long, there isn't a huge amount of data. So I'm nulling at the moment. You can see that's now disappeared. And if I go to log, I can see at the top the most current action that it's been completed successfully. And just to show you, if we go back to the show table, and the distance, then instead of having an absolute value, then what we're looking at here is the most current value with reference to the 0 null that was defined. Now, knowing that the median was set, and then we can see here that the most current value is a very small difference compared to that time period. So this video concludes the options for setting a null reference or a 0 value for a distance.